As the cycles of horror exploitation had grown tired, the horror genre became noticeably less prominent, with audiences tiring of the same conventions. By the 2010s, the horror genre was ready for a revamp, which came in the form of the horror renaissance by a number of new auteur directors. In the words of Benson Allett, the films of the current horror renaissance remain notable for what they are not: slasher movies, torture porn, remakes or reboots, sci-fi thrillers, or action horror hybrids. This paved the way for more psychologically complex horror films to fill the gap, focusing on human stories with more nuanced narratives. Those leading the charge with the current post-horror genre cycle have been independent studios, which have been able to discover and break into this niche market through risk-taking and experimentation with form. One of the most prolific directors of this new genre is Ari Aster, who burst into the independent film industry with his debut feature, Hereditary, and followed it up with the similarly lauded Midsommar. Ari Aster has since carved a name for himself as one of the most prolific horror renaissance directors to date. While these two films were commercially and critically successful, his newer, lesser-known film, Beau was a lot more polarizing due to its more darkly comedic, absurdist approach to horror. Each film was produced in an entirely independent context by A24, an independent American film studio that also handled their distribution. This video essay will be discussing the influence this independent studio system has had on Aster's filmography, specifically Hereditary and Beau was Afraid, and how these films, as genre pieces, remain appealing to a mass market while injecting elements of art cinema to challenge traditional Hollywood form, creating new, innovative stories in the process. While the term independent cinema once specifically denoted any production produced outside of the context of the Big Five studios, today the term has been broadened to describe a certain indie aesthetic. Newman describes this as having small-scale, personal, artistic, and creative connotations, as opposed to the large-scale commercial media industry that values money more than art that's implied by the blockbuster model. A24 is no doubt an independent studio. However, with the lines of an official definition of indie cinema becoming more blurred, their artistic approach to film still has a certain level of mainstream appeal that makes them commercially viable. The works of Ari Aster seem to strike this balance, creating works heavily influenced by art cinema and taking experimental approaches while successfully appealing to the mainstream market in a growing niche of the horror genre. Bordwell states that the art film director has a creative freedom denied to their Hollywood counterpart, a freedom which Aster uses to explore thoughtful allegories for a contemporary American anger and despair, as well as families perverted by fear or prejudice, creating sympathy for deeply flawed heroines and abject heroes. But according to Bordwell, the way Aster has tailored this as a specific mark of his work can be also read as a concept of authorship to unify the text, which Bordwell attributes to the art cinema mode of filmmaking. Aster's debut feature-length film, Hereditary, follows a trauma-ridden family as they piece together that a demon is possessing members of their household with the help of their recently deceased matriarch. The film places a lot of focus on the youngest child, Charlie, during the first act, setting her up as a big part of the film. Save for some expository text, Charlie's treehouse is the first thing we see on screen, and in the scenes following she seems to be the primary character whose perspective we view the film from. This is seen during the funeral, observing narrative clues from her direct point of view through the camera placement, as well as extended scenes of her acting strange at school, which adds a level of intrigue to the character. Through these scenes and the knowledge of holotropes, we are able to infer that Charlie is possessed in some way, and expect that her role in the story will continue to develop. Traditionally in a classical possession film, it's expected that the possessed character, especially a child, would wreak havoc on the family through the course of the runtime. However, Aster subverts this expectation by killing the character off before anything remotely demonic happens. Charlie is suddenly decapitated at the end of the first act, and the story shifts dramatically from being about the horror of literal demons to exploring the horror of a mother's grief. The shock of losing this main character so suddenly defies traditional Hollywood narrative norms, while still evoking the same emotional dread response that the horror genre strives for. Bordwell states that in the art cinema, there occurs the realization of the anguish of ordinary living, the discovery of unrelieved misery, and that social forces impinge upon the psychologically sensitive individual. Looking through this lens, the true fear of Hereditary doesn't come from its supernatural elements, but the very real terror of losing loved ones and the inability to control fate. A lack of agency is also a staple of this concept, with Bordwell going on to say that while the Hollywood protagonist speeds directly towards the target, the art film character slides passively from one situation to another. This is a big motif in Hereditary, with the family exhibiting their lack of agency throughout. The first scene of the film opens on a miniature version of the house, which the camera zooms into, revealing the film's characters. Aster has said that this is the perfect metaphor, in that the family are dolls in a dollhouse being manipulated by outside forces. Even the cursed object trope when you think the film is at its climax is subverted, only spurring on consequences when the main character attempts to express any agency, which helps to further separate this art house horror from a classical Hollywood narrative. Following Hereditary, Ari Aster's popularity soared, and his follow-up film Midsummer was released to further critical and commercial success, building his status in the genre. With 2 very successful feature-length films now on his resume, he was able to secure the trust of the studio to fund Beau is Afraid. This stars Joaquin Phoenix as an anxious, middle-aged Jewish man who gets reluctantly thrown into an absolutely miserable Freudian odyssey and is repeatedly manipulated, humiliated, and emasculated by the manifestations of all his anxieties. That is pretty much the plot, not following Beau out of a desire to see him succeed in chasing a goal, but more to explore an encyclopedic journey of the film's world. This is Aster's most avant-garde work to date, with an even more clear auteurist approach than his previous more accessible films. While Hereditary and Midsummer were made with the horror audience in mind, rooting their story in familiar tropes, Beau is Afraid was made for absolutely no one but Ari Aster himself, which results in a deeply personal journey that still explores psychological themes of anxiety and mental illness through its drifting, shifting, loose narrative. The film is very art-inspired, with Bordwell stating that art cinema is a cinema of psychological effects in search of their causes. This approach is what makes Beau is Afraid so interesting. The psychological effect on Beau is his deep-rooted anxieties, but the cause of his trauma is withheld from the audience and is deliberately confusing to prompt deeper readings from the text, making multiple viewings rewarding as more clues are extracted. These include densely packed details and frames, with subtle recurring background characters that are never acknowledged, and blink-it-you'll-miss-it clues vital to understanding the movie's full implications. In the art cinema, this movie fits into the subcategory of puzzle film, which in the words of Holland, puzzles, disturbs, presents us with an emotional riddle, but puts it in an intellectual and aesthetic context. Beau is Afraid simultaneously confuses the audience while prompting them to figure out what exactly is going on in Beau's mind, recalling Bordwell's idea that in the art film, viewers are prompted to question who is telling the story and why are they telling the story, rather than focusing on what the story itself is. Holland goes on to say that puzzle films duplicate an experience we have all had, one which was at one time irritating, even frightening, a constant reminder of our own helplessness in the face of forces much bigger than we. This pretty much sums up Aster's approach to horror. While Beau is Afraid doesn't directly scare, it plays on the deep-rooted, highly specific anxieties around having a lack of control over your own life, forming the core philosophy behind the horror renaissance genre and Aster's filmography. With A24's notorious hands-off approach to their productions, auteurs working under the independent studio such as Aster have complete creative control, with minimal intervention from the company. This differs from the Hollywood model, which is constantly interfered with by the various institutions that have influence over the end product and how it's constructed. Beau is Afraid was a box office bomb, making only $11 million on a $35 million budget due to its less accessible style, but has contributed to the mythos of A24 in the process, ultimately reinforcing their image as the studio that isn't afraid to take on more experimental features that challenge traditional Hollywood storytelling. With success stories such as Hereditary becoming increasingly common for the studio, with the help of Ari Aster and other auteurs, this independent model seems to be moving strongly into the future.